Welcome back to the sewing room. I'm Laura and I'm here today to talk to you about thread. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on everything. I do love to sew. I love learning about sewing. I love books about sewing. Would you be surprised to hear that in all of those sewing books behind me, and there are a lot of them and they're mostly about sewing, there's not a lot of advice about what kind of thread to use, which is annoying. I guess they figure you just know. But I did pull 3 of my books that have really good solid information about choosing the right thread for your project. So let's get into it. Alright, we're going to start with A Blast from the Past. Clothing Construction by Evelyn Mansfield. This book is from 1953, and she says, the selection of thread for a garment ordinarily will involve 3 considerations: color, size, and fiber, cotton, silk, or nylon. Since thread must hold a garment together firmly and permanently, but at the same time inconspicuously, you should select a thread as much like the fabric as possible in color, luster, yarn size, and elasticity. In matching, select thread a shade darker, or lay a single thread across the fabric, since thread appears to be a shade darker on the spool than when stitched into the fabric. Table 4 indicates correct thread and needle sizes for fabrics of various weights. I do love, this is actually in an appendix. Love this book. Oh, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Now, with all that said, this was quite some time ago, so let's take a look at a slightly newer book. This is Mother Pletsch's Painless Sewing. This is a kind of raggedy copy, but I love it. I picked it up, I'm sure, at some used bookstore somewhere. This was first printed in 1975. This is the 1980 printing. And I love her advice. First of all, we have a few thoughts on thread crossed out and changed into a dissertation, which is pretty much how I think everyone feels if they've written something and it's longer than they thought it was going to be. I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's quite long. Do check it out, but I will note that there is a big shift between the 50s book and the 70s book in that polyester thread was now a thing. It was not a thing in the 50s, no one had it yet. And while I don't wear a lot of polyester garments or fabrics, I do use a lot of polyester thread. It's actually my favorite all-purpose thread. It's the first thing I go to unless I have a reason not to. Now, if you are Lisa Neal, not Laura Neal, and you do a lot of hand sewing and you sew with a lot of silk and a lot of kind of heavier cottons, well, and then once again, a lot of hand sewing, you will find that silk or cotton thread will sometimes work better for you than the polyester thread, because the polyester thread, when you're hand sewing, does have a greater tendency to tangle. Now, you can deal with that, but it can be a little annoying. But for me, I love polyester threads in my sewing machine. I use them all the time. But just some quick tips from the dissertation on thread that was written in the 70s. Basically saying that polyester thread is pretty much an all-purpose thread, since it can be used on any fabric. It doesn't shrink or fade and is the strongest, so it's ideal for hemming. You'll never have another hem thread break. Polyester thread also stretches, making it compatible with knits. But there is definitely a difference in the quality of the mini polyester threads on the market. A bargain thread may create many headaches. Good advice in the 70s and still great advice today. Thread is one of those things, as a beginning sewist, you will be quite shocked at how expensive it is. And you may be tempted to go with whatever the least expensive option is, but very, very cheap or poorly made or very old or poorly stored or all of the above thread is a false economy. It will make your sewing less happy, it will possibly damage your sewing machine with lint, and ultimately your garments might not last as long, and who wants that? So just please remember, yes, good thread can be a little more expensive, but it's usually worth the cost. Anyway, back to the 70s. Look for a thread that is smooth, even, fine, and strong. Still great advice. Both all polyester or cotton-wrapped polyester threads are good. Now, I can't speak to this directly because I've never used a cotton wrapped polyester thread, but you know, if she says so, sure. And then she talks about staple length and etc., etc. When hand sewing with synthetic threads, use a shorter than normal length to reduce static buildup and knotting, and cut thread diagonally off the spool for easier needle threading. All great advice. She then enumerates cotton thread, silk buttonhole twist, polyester buttonhole twist, and then a little bit of discussion about thread color. Now, I just said that I use all-purpose thread for almost everything, but the one thing that did get a lot easier when I changed my mind about that was that I started using buttonhole thread. I'm using polyester buttonhole thread, and I'm using a couple of different weights, but honestly, when I switched to buttonhole thread, it got a lot better. Pati, I think this is Pati, well, it's Pati and Susan. I'm not sure who wrote the dissertation. It might be Susan. But she does point out that some darker colors of buttonhole twist, and this is true for silk, might not be completely color fast. Navy, black, and red. If you're using a dark color on a light fabric, make a test sample and launder it. I'm not sure if that's still true 50 years later, but it's still good advice. If you're going to use a bright color or a dark color on a buttonhole, or even just for top stitching, I think it really makes sense to test it. And frankly, I always test my buttonholes to see, if my buttonholer is set up correctly, if I'm happy with the size of how the buttonhole is going to look, and also to test, cutting it open and making sure I've done that at least once before I do my actual garment. So yeah, this is great advice. I would make my little test buttonhole, treat it just the same as I'm going to the garment, and then launder it just the same as I would the garment if I want to be sure that the colors won't run, because that would be really sad, wouldn't it? We don't want that. So great advice here about thread color. Pati was a very frustrated buyer for a sewing notions department when she found her customers always insisting upon perfect thread match for every fabric. We like to use matching threads whenever possible, but we certainly don't drive to 76 stores nor lose sleep over it if we can't match it perfectly. Generally, choose thread a shade darker, as it will appear lighter off the spool as it sews in. If a perfect match for top stitching is not possible, go a shade lighter for a dressier look and a shade darker for a sportier look, or a complete contrast for a very casual appearance. Now, this is still good advice. The 76 stores isn't even an option for most of us. In most towns you have one, if you're lucky, two in-person stores to buy thread. So, this is very 70s. I don't know if people had 76 stores back then either. Maybe they were lucky enough to. But in other words, she's saying do your best, but don't go nuts. All right, last but not least, my final resource for today is actually modern. This book is from 2011. It's great, and it has a whole chapter on thread. Hold it up. I'm not going to read you the whole chapter. It is definitely worth reading, but I did want to make another note about the color, which is something I hadn't thought of. You want to match the color when you can. The traditional rule for selecting thread color when an exact match isn't available is to choose thread that's a shade darker than the fabric. We've already seen that twice. On the other hand, you can choose a lighter color thread, often white or ivory, when stitching on pale colored, fine, lightweight fabrics. Lighter thread colors blend better on pastel fabric colors than darker shades do. Unroll a few inches of any thread you are considering, lay them over your fabric in natural light, and then decide which color blends best. When stocking your sewing room, purchase spools of black, white, off-white, mid-range gray, khaki, navy, and red thread. In a pinch, one of these colors can blend with nearly any color of fabric. And for decorative stitching, anything goes. Choose by color, texture, or weight. Love it. You heard it here, folks. Match your color when you can. When you can't, you might only need one of 7 different colors of thread. Now, if you're wondering, what about thread thickness, type? Are there special threads for thicker fabrics like upholstery and really, really light fabrics like lingerie? And what about serger threads? Those are different, right? And then there's some even weird ones for those, aren't there? What's woolly nylon? How much thread do you need for each kind of project? If those are all questions you're having right now, I'm happy to tell you that those are all the videos I have planned for the next couple weeks. So stay tuned. Feel free to subscribe, make sure you don't miss anything. And I hope you like this video, and I'll see you soon.